In this video, I want to talk a little bit about artwork and specifically working with crayons. Now, in one of my recent videos, I mentioned how when I was very young, I used to have seizures and fevers, and I would get very frustrated, either with pain or whatever, and I would stipple with crayons. And stippling is the effect of just making dots on a surface. And then now I stipple with ink and very fine tip point pens. But I want to talk about crayons today because for a few years I was making my own beeswax crayons, and I was selling them at one point. I don't sell them right now. And the reason I started doing that, all through growing up, and then of course I gave them to my son as well, I've had Crayolas. And there are other brands, Prang, I can't think of a lot right off the top of my head, but I've always had Crayolas. Now the advantage to the Crayola 64 box is that you have 64 consistent colors. They have changed their colors over the years. Back in the early 60s, their burnt umber was in the box. Now I don't think there's a burnt umber in here. It's now sepia. So they change the names, they might change the formulas, but basically you have a fairly consistent set of colors, 64 colors. They're also extremely economical. A box like this is about $7. If you buy them online, sometimes they're $10, but you can get them for about $7. Crayolas also come in packs of 16, 24, 48. But I like the 64 because it gives you a good range of colors. So we have those there. We have, these are imported beeswax crayons made by Stockmore. And there's the image that they put with the crayons. And I have to say that's kind of an accurate image because they lay down fairly thick and heavy. Now, when I made my beeswax crayons, which are over here, what I did was make specific colors that I use all the time. I used raw pigments, beeswax, and a slight little bit of paraffin wax so that the crayons weren't too soft and didn't break too much or too easily. But what I was basically doing was picking out colors that I use on a regular basis in addition to those, to the Crayolas. So now this is what I do more recently, which is, this is a stippled pear. And this morning what I've been doing is crayons on different surfaces. I love playing, really, with crayons, drawing with crayons. It's very therapeutic. It's also, it can be fine art, it can be coloring book art, it can just be art. It doesn't have to be explained. Now, obviously the stippled pear looks like a very fine drawing, which when I'm done, it will be, and it will be detailed. So using a pear as an example, let me show you crayons on a few different surfaces. Both of these canvases are inexpensive 4x4 Dick Blick canvas panels, and I have coated them with an acrylic paint surface. Now this is Crayolas with about one layer of my own beeswax crayons on there. So it's a fairly pale work. It's a little bit bumpy. What I tend to do is lay down initial layers with the Crayolas, and then say the top 2 or 3 layers will be beeswax. And I'm looking at it from a painting aspect instead of a coloring aspect. I'm building layers of paint. I'm looking at the wax as if it's paint. So that's what it looks like with I think 3 layers of Crayola and maybe 2 of beeswax. mostly my own beeswax crayons. Now, when I did the same thing with Stockmore, started the same way, did initial layers with Crayolas, then maybe one layer of my own beeswax, and when I got to the Stockmores, you can see how much thicker it lays down. This particular canvas seems to have stripes in the surface, but just by comparing the two of those are just simply two different types of beeswax crayons. Now the Stockmores are wonderful crayons. I love them. They're very big, so you will get, even if you're not a young child, they're good for young children to hold, but even if you're not a young child, you will get a thick, not blocky surface, but chunky almost. It's almost chunky, and it's a little bit more difficult to work with on canvas. So then, one of my other ones is this. Now this is my own beeswax crayons on Strathmore drawing paper. And out of all the different methods that I've used crayons, or the surfaces that I've used crayons, this is closest to this. You can very easily do beautiful fine art by layering crayons. Now, this is not one of my colors, so that would be a Crayola. And again, same thing. Start the layers with Crayola and then build them up a little bit, and you can see this is a little bumpy and rough. And you can use this when you're developing your own style. This one on the right is one style, and on the left is a different style. So obviously people are going to prefer different effects with the crayons, but this one is the closest to that one, as far as instead of having you know, like 10 pens out with 10 colors, and stippling in ink is a wonderful, rewarding thing to do, but it entails much more equipment. With this, all you need is a box of crayons and some paper, drawing paper. Now, so then, my next thought was, well, gee, since I've done crayon on canvas quite a bit, I can take a block print and I can go either over the dog image or around the dog image in crayon. And I can already tell, this has been dry for a couple of weeks, I can already tell the crayon, especially beeswax, or maybe even especially the Crayola, because it's a little bit harder. You know, the actual crayon is stiffer than beeswax crayons. It's going to push where you see the black out of the way, especially on a canvas surface. So I would probably, on something like this, do the background or the surrounding area first. And then my dog is brown, so I might take like 2 or 3 brown colors and just go over the dog, knowing that I may lose the outline or I may lose the black. So, and again, this is a 5x7 Blick canvas with acrylic paint surface on it before I block printed the dog. So there are many different ways that you can use crayons that aren't only limited to coloring books. But I have to say, this morning, what I found out, as I'm working on these different surfaces today, I decided to get out a coloring book. And this one was very inexpensive at CVS. It's a $1 coloring book, Busy Bee. And this is a combination of Crayola and beeswax. And what I found is, now I don't generally use coloring books. I mean, I have several of them, but these pages are specifically with Crayola. Well, actually, this one is beeswax. And what I was doing this morning, and obviously I didn't color them in professionally, quote unquote, but I was seeing how the crayon reacts on the surface. Now, this is a Crayola, and this is beeswax, and you can see that this type of paper, which is close to a newsprint paper, really grabs the pigment, grabs the crayon right off the crayon. So coloring books are not necessarily to be discarded as being too young. This area I layered color. So I've got 3 or 4 colors on the top part and then just filled it in. And again, found that the paper, the type of paper this is, grabs the color right off of the crayon. So these, obviously these aren't really fine art. I guess you could frame them. You could do them really well and then frame them. And you could also make your own coloring book by using plain black Higgins India ink and a crow quill pen. A bottle of ink is like $4. The crow quill pen is like another $2 or $3. And you could draw your own ink outline and then do coloring and make it your own fine art, frame it. You have to be careful with that type of a pen point on newsprint, so you might want to use drawing paper. But crayons, which are pigment held in a wax stick, are wonderful to use even in coloring books. So whether you're just coloring for relaxation, you might want coloring books. Whether you want to go into more of a fine art application, whether you just like crayons and want to have all different kinds of crayons and want to do different things with them, Strathmore drawing papers are very good. Blick has sketchbooks and sketch papers that are very good to use. This is the paper that this pair is on is probably the best paper I use, is Winsor & Newton hot press watercolor paper, and 140-pound paper. And this has been the paper that I use for about well, almost 40 years. So that's the best paper that I would recommend. And this is Strathmore drawing paper. But you can see right here with these two that you can buy a box of Crayola crayons, or you can get adventurous and make your own beeswax crayons. It's not very difficult to do at all. I have a crayon mold, which now they have kind of been more difficult to find. But Crayola does make a crayon machine, so you can always use that, and you can use your own pigments, and have to be aware that a lot of raw pigments are not non-toxic, that they can be toxic. But you can delve into making your own crayons, or you can just buy commercial beeswax crayons, and with just a box of crayons and paper you can do almost the same type of fine art as very detailed and time-intensive stippling in ink. One other thing about wax on canvas. This is an abstract that I did, I don't know, a long time ago, on a 5x7 Blick panel, canvas panel. And again, Crayolas combined with my own beeswax crayons. But when you work on canvas, you might think that they look pretty chunky or blocky, or this one obviously was influenced by the background color of the acrylic paint, which is pink. I also have some painted in yellow and green, so you can use the acrylic background color to work with or against your subject. But these two I just did this morning. In about a week, the wax on them will harden. And if, like in this one, I want to fix the shadow area over on the right. And if I let this sit for about a week, the surface will harden enough where you can add more layers. Now this one, like I said, I had done this at least 3 or 4 years ago, and it's still waxy feeling, but it's definitely a surface that you could add more to. And that is what happens when you're working with crayon, even if it's on paper. When you start to get bumpy areas, like down here, then you really have to be careful, because the next step after getting some bumpy areas is that the crayon stick will actually lift the crayon up off the paper. And that is most evident on this one with the thicker, heavier Stockmore crayons. I had to reapply some through here because the green that they have was picking my greens up off the canvas. Now, most of mine look paler like this. I have done some intense ones like the Stockmore, but most of mine use the transparency of layering crayon for an effect. Probably because I've stippled ink for so many years that that's what I'm used to, that's what I like, is layering of color. And like with this one, I think only the base layers on this are Crayola, and this is mostly my beeswax crayons. And you would be surprised, this probably only took me a half an hour, maybe an hour at the most, whereas this pair will end up taking probably 50 hours, maybe 40. One of my larger pen and inks that I can remember right off the top of my head took 96 hours. So depending on what your budget is, what your goal is, obviously a box of Crayola crayons and a coloring book, and even I'm sure there are other permanent black ink pens that you could use. You could even use ballpoint pen to draw your own coloring book pages and then color them in. You know, you could hang out at an art store, and you have to feel the paper. When you go to an art store, feel the paper. Charcoal paper is going to be similar to a canvas. The reason I work on canvas a lot of times is because this becomes self-standing, and it can either be framed or it doesn't have to be framed. I usually wrap each one in wax paper, and when I store them away, it's a little bit better than oil pastels, because oil pastels become much more opaque, but crayon you can layer color. And like I said, this one's a few years old, and I could actually add to this if I wanted to now. It'll only take about a week for these, or less. I could even probably on this one work on it again tomorrow if I wanted to. This one, I've only used the Stockmore as like accent crayons because I've made my own. So this, I'm not really sure how long it'll take to kind of get a hardened layer on the top. But you can see there's a lot of things that you can do with crayon.